Well, I apologize. I got interrupted yesterday. So I thought I would just take my glasses off here because I'm outdoors, as you can see, surrounded by mountains and greenery. Looks like somewhere in the Dolomites in northern Italy. So Bilbo heard a ring at the door and knock on the door, knock, 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 and he said, "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting." When he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg and said, "Dwalin, at your service," with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? Oliver, what would you do? Nicole? They had not been at table long. In fact, they'd hardly reached the third cake when there came an even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last." That's what he was going to say to Gandalf this time. But it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he'd been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He tied his red one next to it and, "Balin at your service," he said with a hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it, however painful, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if that's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake. Seed cake, if you have any." "Lots." Bilbo found himself answering to his own surprise, and found himself scuttling off too to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch two beautiful round seed cakes, which he'd baked this afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Dwalin and Balin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them when loud came a ring at the bell again, and another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was two more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Keely, at your service," said one, and Feely, added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin are here already, I see," said Keely. "Let's join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner while the four dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and didn't want to, for they sounded much too adventurous. When ding a ding a ding, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say, by the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen and whether they would all stay for supper. Then the bell rang even louder and they had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all. It was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He'd hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dorry, Norry, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of another. More dwarves, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He'd also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Biffa, Boffer, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Biffa, Boffer, and Bomber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Biffa, Boffer, and Bomber on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty and said nothing about service. But poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we're all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there's something left for latecomers to eat and drink." "What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Biffa. "And mince pies and cheese," said Boffer. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarves through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "Just bring out the cold chicken and the pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling most positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he got all the bottles and the dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confiscate and bebother these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fila and Kili behind them. And before he could say knife, they'd whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool by the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked and talked and ate, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and the glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking in fright. "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bent the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping pole. When you're finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates. And of course, they did none of these dreadful things. And while everything was cleaned away and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the room trying to see what they were doing, then they were back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, it went up the chimney, behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings. And then he blushed to think how proud he'd been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Fili and Kili rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bomba produced a drum from the hall. Biffa and Boffa went out too, and they came back with clarinets that they'd left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine on the porch, and just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with viols, as big as themselves. A viol is like a violin, only a bit bigger, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a Greek cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else and was swept away into the dark lands and the strange moons, far over the water and very far from the hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the hall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one and then another began to sing, as they played deep-throated singing of the dwarves in deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be like their song without their music. "Far over the mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to seek the pale, enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells while hammers fell like ringing bells in places deep where dark things sleep in hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord their many a gleaming golden hoard they shaped and wrought, and lights they caught to hide in gems of hilt on sword. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars, on crowns they hung the dragon fire, in twisted wire they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold to dungeons deep and caverns old we must away ere break of day to claim our long forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harps of gold where no man dwells. There lay they long, and many a song was sung unheard by men or elves. The pines were roaring in the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread. The trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and men looked up with faces pale. The dragon's ire, more fierce than fire, laid low their towers and houses frail. The mountains smoked beneath the moon. The dwarves, they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall to dying fall beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day to win our harps and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands, and by cunning, and by magic moving through him, a fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something Tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and to explore the caves and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out of the windows. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark heavens. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably somebody lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons setting on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flame. He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins of Bag End Underhill again. He got up trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch a lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin in a tone that seemed to show that he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said all the dwarves. "Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush," said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale." He paused for breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and worst of all, fellow conspirator, though no noise came out. He was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, our means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all, to the estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarves. I think I should be right in naming Feely and Keely, for instance. The exact situation at the moment may require a brief explanation." This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he'd been allowed, he probably would have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any more. At "may never return," he began to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firelight glare the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept on calling out, struck by lightning," all over again. And that was all they could get out of him for a long time, so they took him and laid him out of the way on the drawing room sofa with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf as they sat down again. "Gets funny queer fits, but he's one of the best, as fierce as a dragon in a pinch." If you've ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Tuck's great-great-granduncle Bullroarer, who was so huge for a hobbit that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins at Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields and knocked their goblin King Golfimble's head off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won and the game of golf invented at the same time. In the meantime, however, Bullroarer's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing room, After a while and a drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlour. This is what he heard Gloin speaking. Or some snort more or less like that. Will he do you think? It's all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should not have been. I should have been sure we'd come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar. Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The tuck side had won. He suddenly felt he'd go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a times afterwards the Baggins part regretted what he did now, and he said to himself, Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and you put your foot into it. Pardon me, he said, if I have overheard words that you were saying. I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about, or your reference to burglars, but I think I'm right in believing, this is what he called being on his dignity, that you think I am no good. I will show you. I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I'm quite sure you've come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts, but treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, and I will try it. If I have to walk from here to the east of east and fight the wild werewolves, excuse me, I'll repeat that, and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert. I had a great granduncle once, Bull Roarer Tuck, and he. Yes, but that was a long time ago, said Gloin. I was talking about you. And I assure you there is a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and reasonable reward. That's how it usually read. You can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do, it's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of the sort in his parts looking for a job at once, and that he'd arranged for a meeting here Wednesday tea time. Of course there's a mark, said Gandalf. I put it there myself, and for very good reason. You asked me to find the 14th man for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have all the bad luck you want, or go back to digging coal. He scowled so angrily at Gloin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned and frowned at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows, till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. That's right, said Gandalf, let's have no more argument. I've chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I say he's a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes. There's a lot more to him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. You may possibly all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp and let's have a little light on this. I'll stop there and carry on tomorrow.